Hey guys, I'm Kimberly from the Fat Quater Shop Studip, and I'm here today with Cheryl Cohorn, who knows all about Evenweave and linen, and she's going to tell us the difference between the two, and at the end we're going to do some stitching. So how do you want to start?
Okay, well first of all we'll just go over the basic difference in Evenweave fabric and linen. You can really divide your cross stitch fabrics into two categories. Evenweave, the threads are all the same size, so when you look at it, each little square looks perfectly even. The linen fabric, the threads are different sizes. Some are thicker than others. So for example, we have some packages of Evenweave here that we do sell at Fat Quater Shop, and these are all different colors and examples of Evenweave. So all the threads in these fabrics are the same size, as opposed to some linens, which are packaged over here, and we can show those later. When you look at linen fabric, it's very obvious that some of the threads are very fine, very thin. Some of the threads are much thicker. So there's a definite difference in the look of the fabric, and there's also a little difference in the feel of the fabric. Some of the Evenweaves are very soft. The linens usually are a little bit stiffer. And linen, the Belfast linen, like we have some packages here of Belfast linen, and this particular one, I have a piece out of the package, is one of my very favorites. It is Country Vintage Mocha. And this happens to be 32 count, which is my very favorite count to stitch on.
And when you're stitching with linen and Evenweave, you stitch over 2 squares, right? As
Yes.
opposed to Ada is 1 square.
Correct. Ada is typically 100% cotton. I made some notes just so I wouldn't misquote. Belfast linen is 100% linen. The Evenweaves are a little bit different. Lugana is 52% cotton, and we have Lugana in several different colors. 52% cotton and 48% viscose. Joblean is another kind of Evenweave fabric that I did not bring a piece of that with me, but the feel and look is very much like the Joblean. And that is the difference. Very, very simple, but they do have a different feel.
So when you're shopping for your projects to make stuff, how do you pick between it? Is it more the color or the look, or do you try to match it to your pattern, or how do you pick what you're going to stitch with? Because you stitch with so many things.
Okay, I start basically with the color, and then depending on what the project is, if it's a vintage looking project, sometimes I tend to go more with linen because it looks like a vintage fabric, generally speaking. And then others, if I have the right color in an Evenweave and I don't have the right color in a linen, I'll use Evenweave. I love them both.
And how do you store all of your, because she has lots of different fabric, so tell me a little bit about how you store those at home so you keep them all separate. How do you do that?
I do have a lot of fabric. So I have them in bins, plastic bins, and I have one bin for just a plain solid color Evenweave. They come in different counts, 25, 28, 32 basically. So I have a bin with all Evenweave 28 count. I have a bin with all Evenweave 32 count. Then I have a bin of the counts that maybe are specialty, like for instance our whitewashed board. I would call that a specialty. It's not just a solid, it's a specialty fabric. So I have one bin that is all my specialty fabric in 28 count. Then I have a bin of specialty Belfast and a bin of solid Belfast. So lots of fabric.
So let's do some stitching.
So Kimberly wanted me to make a few stitches on the fabrics, just as an example of stitching over 2, typically on linens, the smaller counts, the 28, well, some people own 25, 28, 32 count, you will stitch over 2. So, for instance, we have 14 count Aida, and I thought it would be a good idea. I'm one of those who uses a hoop. Yes, I do nearly always use a hoop. I like these spring hooks. You just squeeze them and they fit into the frame. Thought so that you could see on larger fabric what it looks like when you're stitching over 2. You very rarely would use 14 count to stitch over 2, but this will show you a little more easily with the big squares. So typically you're going, of course, in the corner of the very next square, but when you're stitching over 2, you will skip a square, you will go over 2 and up 2. So your squares, your stitches will actually be twice as large. So if you're using 28 count fabric stitching over 2, your stitch will be the same size as if you were stitching on 14 count. If you're stitching on 32 count over 2, would be the same size stitch or same size X as 16 count. So that's what your stitch would look like over 2, always up 2 and over 2. So there's an X made over 2 on the 14 count fabric. I just thought it would be easier to see it. Skip that square, come over. So if you were to stitch over 2 on this 14 count, your X would be that size as opposed to stitching over 1. This size. So this is one of my very favorite fabrics to stitch on. It's Lugana, and this piece happens to be 28 count. So my X's will be exactly the same size as the 14 count over 1. And it really is not difficult. After you get started, your eye begins to see
the holes.
And you see 2 as being 1X. And the thing about it, it's so easy to tell if you do it incorrectly. So we're just going to come up here. And these little squares, of course, are tiny. Being 28 count means there's 28 squares per inch. So rather than going over 1, we will count over 1. So we're actually skipping 1, skipping up. I won't even worry about catching that tail because so there's a stitch. Skip 1. So you're always, when you're stitching over 2, you're always going to have 1 square, 1 hole there that's open that you did not stitch in. Skip over one of those threads. And it is very easy. Once you make a few stitches, if you get one in the wrong place, it's very easy to see, which let me show you on this so that it's easier for the camera to see. If I'm stitching over 2, and I forget and I just come over 1 instead of 2, then I come over 2 like I'm supposed to, your stitch will very obviously tell you that's not right. So once you make 2 or 3 stitches, it's very easy, and like I said, your eye begins to see it that way, and it's very simple to tell when you've made a mistake. If you've gone 1 square too far, or if you've stitched over 1 rather than 2. It will be a very odd looking stitch.
So on the Evenweave, can you show us like a row of stitches next to each other?
A row of stitches next to each other, sure. And I'm just using DMC, so we can do a row of stitches, not one at a time if we were like if we were using over dyed. So start, you count over 2. You're going to skip 1 and up, skip 1. So you come up just as if it were 14 count. Come up in the hole just below where you went down. Skip that one, come to the next one. Skip that one, come to the next one. I do use a size 28 needle on 28 and 32 count fabric, and you can kind of feel with the tip of your needle.
And when you're stitching, do you do one stitch at a time? You just pull each up one,
I
down
do.
one?
I do not. I don't really use the sewing method. I think it's because I've done this for so long. It's like an old dog in new tricks. It seems that I can't keep my stitch tension perfect when I use the sewing method. I do stitch in hand occasionally, but usually only if it's a piece of linen that is quite large. So you actually do your stitches exactly the same way. I use 2 strands on 28 count and 32 count.
And if you're a beginner and you have questions on this, for example, which you're stitching on 28 count, if you stitch over 1 box, you would use 1 strand, and if you were stitching over 2, you would use 2 strands, and you would use a size 26 needle. And so this stitch gauge really helps if you're a beginner to know when you're working. This is the different count of material, and the top row tells you how many strands, and the bottom shows you the size of needle, which is really helpful when you're starting out.
That is helpful. And sometimes I find in my fabric, if I have a box that has a few leftover pieces of different sizes, sometimes the 28 and 32 count, it's hard to tell the difference just by looking at a small piece of fabric. And so if you have a gauge, you can line it up with the little threads with the squares in your fabric and determine what size your fabric is. So yes, that's very helpful.
Yeah, that's our #1 question on our YouTube channel is what size needle and how many strands. So
okay. I typically use a 26 needle on, I would say 99% of what I stitch is on 28 and 32 count. If you're doing 25 count Lugana over 2, that would mean your stitch size is equivalent to 12.5. So I might use 3 strands on that and a size 24 needle. But most of my stitching is done with a 26 and with 2 strands of floss.
Well, thanks for sharing all about linen and Evenweave, and subscribe to the Fat Quater Shop Floss Tube channel.